I'd like to do one more astrological prediction, and then I'll talk about my computer programming involved for making these predictions. This is the US dollar to the Japanese yen. The Japanese yen is often said to be a safe haven, but that safe haven is kind of a weird combination of things. The reason being that a lot during the bubble times, right? People take on a lot of debt in order to finance their investments. The Japanese yen historically has a very low interest rate. They've had interest rates at zero since I believe 1991 because of the real estate bubble. It collapsed in Japan. So a lot of debt is taken on, and you would think that would be a bad idea because the Japanese yen is so strong, has been so strong. But during the bubble times, when people are borrowing Japanese yen to buy presumably other currencies in order to invest in their stock markets, that depresses the Japanese yen. So it creates an anti-bubble, if you will, in the Japanese yen. And then obviously, when all the margin calls come, right? So 2008 is right here. The dot-com bubble, the Japanese yen didn't really rise that much because they were also deflating. Let's see what other bubble we have. This is an interesting case. In 1985, we had what's known as the Plaza Accord. At the time, the U.S. dollar was getting stronger and stronger because in the 70s, Paul Volcker had raised interest rates to 21% in order to slow the inflation down. And the dollar got very strong during the first term of Reagan, and this was really bad for exports. But the thing is, the Plaza Accord only involved a very small amount of money, right? And a lot of people say that doesn't justify all this. What probably happened was the dollar was getting way too strong. People were wondering where the top was. Nobody wanted to get out because they didn't want to miss the top. And then all of a sudden you had this event that quickly gave people an excuse to sell, right? It's kind of like in 2020, the stock market was already going crazy, and then people got wind of the coronavirus, and even though nobody around them was getting sick, it was a slap in the face. And then as soon as some people started to sell, other people had margin calls, right? And everything just unwinds, right? And eventually, and what I really like is that the only thing this my program takes in is the actual data from 1971 to today, right? But it's able to see this unwinding that's coming up, which is what makes me really optimistic. Had it already started and my program just claims it's going to go farther, what I should probably do is cut off the data here to see if I still see this. I'm going to try that later. Or I'll invite you to try some of this. I'm going to talk about how my algorithm works. But right now we are at a little over 100 to 1, and the astronomical algorithms claims it should be closer to 30 to 1, which kind of makes sense, right? During the Plaza Accord, we went from, in 1971, the dollar and the Japanese yen were both backed by gold, right? The dollar was 35 to 1. The Japanese yen was 360 to yen to a US dollar. And at the peak of at the end of the Plaza Accord right here, we were down to 79 to 1, right? So apparently now it's going to happen a whole lot faster because there's a lot more global trade than there was in the 1980s, right? Anyways, I'm kind of excited about that. I don't really have a good way to take advantage of this, except maybe just go to the bank and buy a lot of Japanese yen notes. I don't know. One thing I really despise is that if you buy Japanese stocks and Japanese yen strengthens, right, the Nikkei 225 might not go up, and you're taxed on the gains, even though the Nikkei might have went down, but the yen went up, right? So I wonder if there's an ETF to kind of neutralize some of that, right? But I'll definitely, another thing I might do is buy some rare Japanese coins, right? Especially, Japan made a 100,000 yen gold coin in 1986 to celebrate the 60th year of their empire. If you live outside of Japan, I really recommend those as a safe way to invest in the Japanese yen. I might think about that, although those are going for quite a high premium. I bought a lot of those during the last time we had this problem during the financial crisis. Anyways, to my algorithm. So obviously, when you're looking at the points, right, in this, everything is measured relative to the sun, right? There's going to be a lot of times where you want to convert between rectangular and spherical coordinates, right? The rectangular is basically what we learned in algebra, right? X and Y, right? Spherical tells us how far something is, right? The radius, and then the two angles. I like to think of these two angles as the longitude and latitude. They kind of act like that, right? With a small amount of conversion, right? The stocks I'm reading in, the data comes in. Let me show you what the data file looks like. This is the file that I downloaded. It has the date, open, high, low, close. I haven't done any day trading yet, so what I do is, the first thing I do is average all those numbers together so that I could have a chart that's date to quote, right? In the future, I might analyze the way stock analysts like to draw these are bars, right? And in the future, I might take these as separate inputs and then compute of how we can do some day trading. I'm not a big fan of day trading. I don't tend to do very well every time I do it. I'm addicted to it, but every time I do it, I lose the shirt off of my back. So I've learned to put a limit on that. But it's a fun exercise just to see how well it would do. That would be okay. So we average the quotes. Oh, we got to get back to astronomical algorithms.cpp. Okay, so we take in a year, month, and day, and we do some math calculations to turn that into a sequential number, right? I believe January 1st of 1600 becomes a 1, and everything is counted after that. So then we have an XY function, right? The date and the quote, right? The date is the X, the quote is the Y. There's some computations if you have the hour and minute and second as well. I haven't gotten to this because, again, I'm doing a long-term chart, right? And then some math calculations. One thing I really despise is that NASA, they still use degrees in their calculation. If you know anything about calculus, having degrees in your calculation really screws up the derivatives of the functions. Actually, we lost a spacecraft on our way to Mars because of a conversion problem just like that. The company that we had contracted to was using radians, and NASA was using degrees, and the spacecraft, did it crash into Mars, or did it fly too close to Mars and got a big boost and left the solar system? One of the two. We lost it. And all because of a stupid conversion like that. I don't like degrees. It's a very artificial definition of the circle. And then, obviously, once you have the conversion, you have to know how to do sine and degrees and cosine and tangent. I think that should be fairly straightforward. All of these calculations revolve around the three-dimensional vector, so you might as well wrap that up into its own data structure, adding, subtracting, not a big deal there. And then actually subtracting is a big deal, because astrology revolves around where all those planets are relative to Earth, right? When you're standing on the Earth, is Mars above the horizon or below the horizon, right? What do you have to do to calculate that? Well, you take the vector of where Mars is and subtract the vector of where Earth is, right? So you get a vector that points from Earth to Mars. What would be really, really interesting is when humans start to inhabit other planets and start trading stocks there, right? How astrology will be affected by that, right? I haven't really given that much thought yet, but it seems relevant, right? Even if a very small population moves to Mars or Jupiter, those are probably going to be the wealthiest people, right? So that even if a small percentage of people move to Mars, a huge percentage of the money is going to move to Mars, right? So I'll probably have to think about how that affects the market. Dot products and cross products, when you have multiple vectors and you want to compute the angles between them, that's when they come into play. The angle is computed by a dot product. Okay, so the really interesting thing comes when we actually compute planets. How do we define a planet? Well, if you think about it, how do we define an orbit around the sun? There are 6 orbital parameters, right? The orbital period of where where it is in the angle in the orbit, the inclination of the orbit, right? For example, the International Space Station, it doesn't orbit the equator of the Earth, right? It orbits at an inclination of 50-some degrees. That's why when Space Shuttle Columbia was in trouble, they couldn't fly to the ISS and dock there, right? NASA briefly considered launching another shuttle to rescue, but at the end there were too if I remember correctly, too many hoops to jump through, and they decided to hope for the best. And I think they did announce to the crew on the shuttle that there was a little damage, and when you launched, and nobody really paid it any attention, right? But the point is, it doesn't orbit above the equator, because if it did, you wouldn't be able to land in Florida without a huge burn, right? So the inclination tells you a little bit about where it is. The eccentricity, right, tells us how circular that orbit is, right? So, for example, every so often, I don't know if any of my viewers are old enough to remember the Halley comet, right? It flies past the inner solar system every 87 years, right? And then it flies way beyond Pluto, right? It's not a very circular orbit. At the extreme case, you could have something that only flies past the solar system, right? That would be a hyperbolic or a parabolic orbit, right? Or I think in 2017 we had an object do just that, right? And we missed our chance. I wish we could have launched something to dock onto the comet and fly out of the solar system. We really missed our chance. We really don't get that many chances to fly out of the solar system because we need several of the large planets to line up in order to have enough energy to do that, at least to launch something heavy, right? We did launch the New Horizons without too many planets in line, but that was very lightweight compared to the Voyagers, right? Or even compared to Cassini, right? Okay, so the problem with that approach of treating orbits as if they're around the big object is that unfortunately all of the planets interact with one another. That's why solar eclipses and lunar eclipses, they don't happen precisely on a regular basis, right? Because the moon and the sun, they both react to Venus and Jupiter especially, right? And some of the other planets. And so how do we go about calculating that? Well, some scientists have taken very precise measurements at certain points in time over the last, since the beginning of the space age, probably, right? And what they've done is worked out some mathematical models and came up with a ton of constants. What they really did was similar to neural networks, right? They have these data points of input, output, and they fit a curve onto them, right? And a lot of these have a lot of significant figures, right? I would imagine they place very high precision cameras throughout the world, or maybe even in space, right? If it's on the ground, you have the problem of atmospheric refraction, right? And then obviously some of the planets, we actually have devices on them as well, right? And so every planet has three sets of parameters, right? One to tell you how far, one to tell you the inclination above the ecliptic, and one to tell you the longitude, right? And all of these, it's a giant polynomial is what it turns out to be. And then at the end of it all, let's go back to the market analysis module. What we do is then calculate where all the planets are, right? Where's the sun, where's the moon? And notice how we subtract Earth from it, right? Because we want to know where it is relative to the Earth, right? And for every one of them, we have a position and a velocity, right? And so what do we know about that? We know where the planet is in our night sky, the direction of it, and more importantly, what direction it's headed, right? Because when certain planets go into retrograde, they cause the market to do funny things, right, compared to prograde. Right, so now we have, and whether or not they're rising or falling relative to the ecliptic, right, which is, a lot of people who do astrology don't do that. That's why I was excited about this program. I wanted to do something that nobody has ever tried before. And then the distance of the planet and whether it's coming at us or away from us, right? Just earlier tonight, Venus was really bright, right? So it's probably close to us. I'm not sure what significance that has on the market. I've never really picked out any parameters or anything. I just look at the charts. I really have to study the parameters more to appreciate it a little bit more, and perhaps to make sure I don't have any mistakes in there. Oh, another key thing. We take the quote and take the log of it. And the reason for that is because everything around our financial world is growing exponentially, right? Our money supply, our national debt, and if you want to fit that onto it, so basically, if you take the log of it, what you'll have is a trend line with a sine or cosine wave on top of it, right? And those sine and cosine waves will correspond to the planets, right? That's why all of the charts, you might have seen the legend of the chart, have funny numbers to them, right? 32, 64, 128, 256. Why is that? Because both the US dollar and the Japanese yen supply are growing, sometimes shrinking, but growing or shrinking exponentially, right? If we didn't take the log scale, we wouldn't, our linear interpolation would quickly fall off the tail end, right? Because obviously, if you went from 360 over here to 100 over here, it would quickly drop to 0 if we tried to interpolate that linearly. So we got to take a log before we do any linear interpolations, right? Anyways, I'll let that sink in. Feel free to ask any questions. I know I'm missing a lot of gaps in between the topics. Thanks for watching.